All right, good morning. This is Geography 10, Lecture 3. We're going to start by finishing our examination of your maps now that we have a bulb in the overhead that works again. Then we'll get on with today's lecture. This is one of the more interesting ones, I thought. It was actually done in color. It doesn't quite turn out nicely. This whole region here was pink. We had a band through here that was light green. This here is sort of aqua blue. It's labeled at the bottom, biofuel, bioenergy plants. I don't know which of you put this together, but it shows, and I don't know whether you relied on the internet to help put these boundaries together, but I thought it was interesting that they mapped the regions of the United States according to the kinds of plants that might be used to grown for use in bioenergy or biofuels projects. So we get miscanthus and switchgrass and hybrid poplars. I think that's trying to point to this area here. Sycamore in the southeast, which I had not heard that was a plant being contemplated for biofuels. Willows up in New England. Switchgrass, reed canary grass in this band through here. I believe that's actually being studied also further east. Eucalyptus and poplars, I guess that's trying to refer to this little region here, which would appear to be, say, the northern Central Valley, perhaps, or the northern Sierra. Hybrid poplars along the coast in the northwest. Interestingly, nothing given for Hawaii. I assume that this little area down here perhaps should have been labeled for sugarcane. And then, if you'll notice, this rather large area through here is basically unlabeled, the implication being that perhaps nothing can be grown there for biofuels. Anybody who did this map want to clarify, or anybody who did this map in the room wish to identify themselves? No. All right. So another way of putting the regions of the United States together. In this case, I think it does a good job of, there is a label or a title for the map. I suppose you might have wanted there to be a single legend with the different colors, but instead the lines indicating the different parts of the country are adequate, I would say. Who knows exactly how accurate this is, but it was an interesting way of thinking about the regions of the United States, and one that might actually be increasingly relevant in the years to come. What do you think of this one? They folded the map, and then they colored the different parts as defined by the folds, and created regions that way, and then they labeled it folding a map into 6 pieces. There's only one problem with this map, apart from the fact that it doesn't really depict anything. What's that? Anybody see? It's actually 8. They folded it in half, and then in half again, and then in half again, and then they miscounted. Regional accents of the United States. New Jersey, New York, Boston all have their own accents. Chicago, which actually takes in the entire Great Lakes. Scandinavian, Texan, Cajun, Southern, SoCal, NorCal going straight up into coastal Oregon and Washington, and then Midwest. And this would put my hometown right on the boundary between Chicago and Midwest. I don't know if that's accurate. Anyway, there were actually a number of maps that focused on accents. We can compare that one with this one. Here we get the funny O, which I guess is, what, all of this? Rather large part of the country. I've never heard of the funny O accent. Actually, it's trying to be actually a couple of different ones here. Let me look at this more closely. The funny O, I'm sorry, the funny O is actually intended to be only these states right up here. And then it doesn't turn out because it's done like red and then pencil and then blue. Country accent is these states here. Normal is this area here. Isn't it the case? Everyone thinks they're the only ones who don't have an accent. Chicago and Brooklyn are treated as one common accent that happens to just have two little spots in the country. What else have we got? For some reason, Kentucky and Tennessee are mapped as being part of country. So country is also discontinuous. It's this area here, and then Texas, Oklahoma, these three states, and Montana. What else? Midwest, Deep South, Northeastern. Again, notice the sort of non-continuous categories. Some of them being geographically defined, Midwest, Deep South, Northeast, that kind of thing. Others being defined by the accent itself, the funny O, for example. Okay, and then the final one, which I mentioned last time, number of illegal immigrants / area and where they're from. A lot here from Mexico, some here from Asia, a lot here from the Caribbean, some from Africa. These are Africans, apparently. Europe and Canada has a few from Europe and Canada here, and then this enormous area here, barely any who knows. And as I said last time, you can actually get some better information on that from the New York Times website if you wish. All right. I think that takes care of the maps. I appreciate your effort. Are there any questions about those? Should we do that again at the end of the semester? See if anything's changed? Uh-oh. The switch is not. There we go. All right. So, housekeeping. Any housekeeping questions? I believe the wait list is now at like 38 people, 37, something like that. Judging from the fact that there are empty seats in the lecture hall, presumably that's going to reduce. It's going to go down further in the week to come. Any other issues anybody needs to raise? No? All right. The reading for today was the first two chapters of Davis, Planet of Slums. Go back here. We're going to talk today about slums as a region, what it means to think about slums as some kind of regional formation. And we're going to use Davis's sort of framing of the issue as a way of talking about how you might go about your research project this semester. You'll notice that he devotes a certain amount of energy or space in the opening two chapters to sort of defining this phenomenon of global slums and setting up how he's going to proceed to analyze it. And I think that's a somewhat instructive case to take and look at in connection with thinking about your own projects this semester. Here's the update, the reading for today. For Thursday, I'd like you to read chapter 3. For Tuesday of next week, we're going to read chapters 1 and 2 of Crosby, Ecological Imperialism. Map quizzes will happen, the first one will happen in sections next week. And I have posted the map and the list of items for that quiz to BSpace. They are there now. The GSI has informed me that there's one city on the list that they have not yet been able to identify where it belongs on the map. We will be looking into that. If any of you can find that mysterious place and identify where that dot belongs, please feel free to send that information along, and perhaps we'll give you a candy bar or something. There is also going to be a movie that we will watch in class, in lecture, a week from Tuesday. And it's about the slums in Rio de Janeiro. Normally, we would watch that during this segment of lectures. However, because I'm going to be out of town that day, I chose to put the movie there instead. So we will start the next section of the syllabus, which is Crosby, but then come back a week from this coming Tuesday, so 2 weeks from today, and watch that movie and discuss it. Okay? Did you have a question?
Yeah, which city?
Oh, no, we aren't going to tell you the name of the city that's mysterious. You have to find the mysterious city first and then find where it belongs. You found all the cities. Well, then you should talk to your GSI. One of them there's a misspelling. It sounds like you are onto it already. But rather than share it with all of us and spoil the mystery, I would ask that you talk to your GSI about it so that you can claim the candy bar. Okay? All right. All right. I showed this slide last time. These are pictures of slums, right? Would any of you doubt that these are pictures of slums? I mean, this one's a little hard to make out at all. It looks kind of like some kind of modern art, but projected so large. But as you'll notice from the labels, these are pictures from all over the world, right? This is in South Africa. This is in Brazil. This is in Indonesia. This is in Venezuela. And yet they all somehow fit, I would guess, into some mental image that we, most of us, I imagine, have in our heads of what a slum looks like. And in the movie, we will be bombarded with these kinds of images. You know, very much like this. This is in Brazil. This is probably very close to the slums that are depicted in the movie. In Rio, they are referred to as favelas, and the movie itself is called Favela Rising. There are different names, but obviously there is something common about these places, right? Or at least in our heads, we have an image of what a slum is, and it looks something like this, I imagine. Anybody not feel like these pictures fit somehow into your mental image of a slum? Have any of you ever been to such a place and actually walked around in one and talked with the people who live there? Yes. Where? You lived in Jakarta. And did you live in or near a place that looked like that? That's what you looked at out your window. And did it sort of dominate the cityscape, that type of place? Okay, but it's not what you were actually living in? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Where and what were you doing? Uh-huh. In Rio or Sao Paulo or where? In Sao Paulo? And you saw places like this? They're hidden? Okay, they're not in the sort of core part of the city. They're sort of tucked away here and there. So could you go about your daily life and not see them at all? Okay. Okay. And were you an exchange student or? So you could actually go to Sao Paulo and spend a semester or a year, and you could see these places but not actually experience them as a part of what? The reality you had to sort of confront every day. Okay. Anybody else? Is that it? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Whereabouts?
I was in Iraq, and it pretty much all looked like that.
You were in Iraq, and it pretty much all looked like that.
No, not all of it, but just some parts of like Sadr City and
Uh-huh.
other places I was at near Baghdad. It's like all pretty much like that, but flat.
But flat. And
It's not like like out in the Brazil, it's like hills. It's all flat.
right.
It's all garbage everywhere.
Garbage everywhere. And was this sort of, did this predate the war, or was these were settlements that had sort of popped up?
No, this was before we got there.
Oh, this was before the Americans got there. But you were there just last year?
No, 2004.
Oh, I'm sorry, 2004. Okay. And so these were sort of informal settlements where people had built their own houses and they were living in.
It was like kind of outside the city. It was like
Uh-huh.
where the poor section was at.
Poor section of the city. Okay. Anyone else? Yes. In Honduras.
Kind of outside the city a little bit, within the hills.
Okay, in the hills outside the center of the city. Any idea how many people were living in?
The whole countryside is filled with them.
The whole countryside is filled with settlements that look like this, but more spread out. Okay. Others? Yeah?
Mexico City.
Mexico City.
It's surrounded by mountains, but it's start going up into the hills.
Okay.
I mean, it turns from, you know, what we would consider normal everyday buildings to more
Okay.
concrete, like little houses.
Uh-huh.
They don't have the same access to water as the city.
Okay. So as you're going out from the center of Mexico City and starting to climb into the hills, you find large areas of settlements like this with limited access to water or sort of what we would consider to be substandard living conditions. Anyone else? Yeah. You've been to Caracas? And again, I would ask, did you actually walk into and spend time in these places? And what were you doing? Uh-huh. So you were volunteering to help with education and other things in that neighborhood. And what kind of experience did you have? I mean, how did it? A lot of buildings didn't have roofs. Okay, so you had classrooms outside because the buildings weren't adequate to actually be a place where you would have classes. Anyone else? Okay. I would note, just from the handful of remarks that we've heard here now, first, that clearly, from your own experience, you can vouch that these places exist in a variety of parts of the world, right? They're not limited to any one place. And that they all seem to share some common features. Again, at least you can identify them as somehow belonging in a category that is somehow captured in these photographs. I suppose it might also be worth noting that as far as, I mean, unless there are a lot of you who aren't raising your hands, only a few of us have actually experienced these places firsthand. Is that fair to say? And I think the remark that you can actually be in one of these cities and go about your daily life and not have to confront the life or lives of the people living in these sorts of places is worth noting, right? I have not spent time in any of the slums in these pictures. I have seen and been in slums in border cities in Mexico, sort of makeshift housing just erected up the sides of the hills with no water or sewer or electricity, that kind of thing. Much smaller scale than these, but a similar type of place. So we know it's worldwide. We know it has certain identifiable features. And we also know that it has a certain kind of social space attached to it. One that is not continuous with, and in many ways isolated away from, the social spaces that we would consider to be what? Developed or modern or, for our purposes, normal. Slums represent a certain variation on or a certain recent development in a larger process that is a central category for geography, and that is urbanization. And I want to talk for a few minutes about what urbanization is. In many ways, when we start reading Crosby, what we are going to be reading about is human history since the advent of urbanization. So this goes back a long way. The term civilization, etymologically, is related to the word city. In many ways, cities are the birthplace and symbol and emblem of civilization. It's where, we might say, agricultural surpluses become wealth. And I want you to think about what that means. You can't have cities unless you have enough agricultural surplus, food, to support the people who live in the cities. Because in many ways, what the cities are is places where people do other things than produce food. Right? And so somehow that agricultural surplus has to get from wherever it's produced into the city. And within the confines of the city, that surplus can essentially transform or be transformed into a variety of other things that we might identify with wealth. And they can include both the activities of people doing things other than growing food and the various tokens or forms of money that are used to facilitate the exchange of that agricultural surplus with the other things that people produce and need. So these are centers of commerce. They are also centers of empire or of political centralization and power. They are sites, more recently, of industrial production and progress. These are the places that we most closely identify with progress and innovation and creativity. They are built environments. You think about the buildings and roads and palaces and churches and museums and schools that you find in cities. They constitute a humanly created environment through which commerce and political organization and power and other processes unfold. And when we get to talking about the modern period, we're going to talk a lot about the relationship between the built environment and cities, urbanization, and the circulation of capital as a form of wealth and power. And finally, these are crucibles for culture, music, politics, art, science, etc. We also identify cities typically with the sort of cutting edge of high culture or high society, right? It's where you go to find the art and the music and the educational institutions that we associate with high culture. Urbanization is also closely linked to what we will come to study and consider as development. And this is more directly relevant to the more recent period. The idea of development in the sense we use that word now, when we say developed countries, developing countries, that kind of thing, that idea is a 20th century idea. It's got roots that go back further, but it is a certain notion about how societies progress, grow, achieve the various kinds of lifestyles and levels of well-being that we consider to be, that we find in some parts of the world and that we consider to be kind of a goal or ambition for other parts of the world. And this is very closely linked to urbanization and the development of cities. So if we think about what it means for urbanization to drive or reflect development, what we're talking about is a process in which increasing agricultural productivity, the ability to produce more food with the same amount of land and labor, reduces the need for labor in the countryside, and therefore reduces opportunities for people to make livings in the countryside, and pushes people towards the cities. They find themselves needing to leave the countryside and migrate to cities in order to find a way to make a living. On the other hand, those same agricultural surpluses that result from increasing productivity enable investments in cities. If you have that agricultural surplus, perhaps you can sell it and use the money you get to invest in things like factories, schools, government, and create jobs, create livelihoods in the cities, and draw people into the cities. And the idea of push and pull factors is a sort of basic concept for thinking about migration, and by extension, thinking about urbanization, the attraction of people into cities, the growth of these cities. And implicit in the idea that this is somehow a positive development, that this is developing towards something that we like, is an idea that these two dimensions can somehow balance each other and reinforce each other. Sort of in the best of all possible worlds, they go together and they reinforce each other. The more development you have of agricultural productivity in the countryside, the more people shift to the cities, and the more there are opportunities in those cities for people to do things. Yeah?
Well, if all the opportunities are moving to the cities, then what are the incentives for people in the agricultural sector to stay?
What are the incentives for people in the agricultural sector to stay? Good question. The idea is that the people in the cities, as they become wealthier, will have more money to spend, and the declining number of people producing the food in the countryside will mean that you don't need as much money to support those people, and you'll have sort of more demand for the food that they are growing in the cities, effective demand, people who can actually buy it, and you will be able to support the people growing the food because at the same time there's a dwindling number of them. Okay? Now, it's not to say, the problem here, of course, is that this balance or positive feedback may not always hold, right? There may well be circumstances in which you don't have the jobs or opportunities in the countryside, but they also haven't developed in the cities yet. Or you might have too many people in the cities and not enough productivity in the agricultural sector to produce the food that's needed for everyone in the cities. So the idea that this will somehow magically move forward in a way that works for everyone, so to speak, and is, sort of produces the kind of prosperity and progress that we associate with development, is not something you can take for granted or just assume. And in many ways, what Davis is talking about when he zeroes in on the question of slums is precisely that this balance, this positive feedback, is not working, is not there, and perhaps that this is a new problem or a new phenomenon in the second half of the 20th century. So here's a map depicting urban areas of 5 million people and over at different points in time. So the empty circles are cities that were that big in 1950. The filled-in circles have become 5 million and over just since 2000. And the little target dots are the ones that are projected in 2015. And this map is a couple years old. Some of these may already have become cities of 5 million and over. But if you look, in 1950, how many of them were there? There was New York, London, Paris. I assume that's probably Berlin, Moscow, Tokyo. Which Chinese city is that? Is that Shanghai? And Buenos Aires. That's it. There were none in Africa, none in South Asia, just one in the United States. And then you can see since 2000, you see the United States has added 2, Chicago and Los Angeles. Mexico City has gotten there. A number of cities, there's sort of a number of capital cities, quite a few in India and China. By 2015, we're looking at an enormous increase in the number of cities of this size. This is the kind of thing that Davis is trying to talk about. And of course, this does not say anything about slums. This is just the sheer number of people concentrated in cities, and the point being that the growth since 1950 is remarkable. Davis focuses much of his discussion in these opening chapters on a report put out by the United Nations on the growth of world cities and slums within them, poverty within them. In 1950, 2/3 of the world's population lived in the countryside. As of the point when this report was generated, and Davis starts, right? Davis starts with this notion that at about the same time that this book is coming out, somewhere in the world, the balance is shifting. It's going from a global population, more than half of which is in the countryside, to a global population, more than half of which is in cities. And he's suggesting that this is a watershed moment. This has never happened before. 3 billion people live in urban areas, and by 2050, it is expected that 2/3 of all people will be living in cities. By the year 2007, more than half of the world population will live in urban areas, and approximately 40% of them will be children below the age of 15. And more than 60% of these will live in African cities. Any reactions or thoughts, questions about that? So what is a slum? How do we actually define it? Obviously, a city is not the same thing as a slum. There's no sort of single criterion for identifying a slum or defining a slum. The definition of a slum consists of a number of different components. And these are the ones that the United Nations used in their report. These are the ones that Davis is going to use. They include overcrowding. Obviously, that's a relative concept, but here we're talking about the idea that people are very tightly packed. They are living at extremely high densities. Poor and informal housing. What is informal housing? Do you live in formal housing or informal housing?
Well, isn't it informal when it's not, you don't have like a legal right? Like the city or the government doesn't recognize your right to.
Okay. Part of being informal is this last one, insecure tenure. They aren't quite the same thing. You're right. Informal, in part, refers to the fact that you don't have a formal claim to be there, to live there. A formal claim to live there would be something like a lease. You have a legal document, a contract, that if anybody walks up and says, you can't be here, you can say, yes, I can. Look, I've got this lease. What is the lease? If you're renting, what does that refer to? It refers to the fact that the person who owns that property has formally granted you the right to live there. Likewise, if you own the place that you live, you've got a title. Someone challenges your right to be there, you can wave the piece of paper in their faces. And if you need to, you can even drag them into court and wag the piece of paper in front of a judge's face. And the judge will say, yeah, you own that space. You're allowed to be there. You have a formal claim to it. Informal housing, I think also, though, kind of in the similar to the idea of poor housing, refers to the fact that the conditions in which that housing was constructed were ad hoc or not necessarily officially to code, for example. Informal housing can refer to the fact that you built it yourself with whatever you could find, and it's not really necessarily the case that the things you're using for a roof were intended to be a roof, right? You may have constructed this with whatever you could find, and in that sense, it's informal as well. Inadequate access to safe water and sanitation. That's pretty self-evident, right? These are frequently these are places where you're not going to have clean tap water coming out of a sink in each abode, each residence. And insecure tenure. Now, insecure tenure can mean a lot of different things. Have any of you ever lived in a condition of insecure tenure? Everyone know what tenure is. Not talking about professors. Yes? No? Are you familiar with this term? Or do we need to talk about it? I need some feedback. When you hear this idea of insecure tenure, do you immediately feel comfortable that you understand what I'm talking about? No. Okay. For a professor, tenure means a claim to your job In the context of land and property, tenure means a claim to land and property. And we're accustomed to thinking about that in terms of ownership, right? I've got a title. Or leasehold. I've got a piece of paper that, officially recognizes my right to be here as a rental agreement with the owner. So in both cases, it goes back to fee title ownership. But there are a lot of other ways you can have tenure to a piece of property. If you think about the way property was organized in the feudal period, you had agricultural producers, peasants, serfs, whose tenure was secure, but not recognized in a contract or a title deed. Which is to say, there was a lord who had control over a piece of land. Again, may or may not have been reflected in what we would call a title today. And that person recognized the right of those peasants to be there farming. And insofar as that person continued to recognize it, and society as a whole recognized it, that tenure was secure. So there is such a thing as secure tenure without a lease or without a title. At the end of the day, what it comes down to is, does society acknowledge and recognize that you can be there and that they can't remove you? If you were a peasant on a feudal manor or property, and you stopped growing food or refused to till the soil and produce food for the Lord, you were at risk of losing your tenure. Because part of your security of tenure was tied to the idea that that was what you had to be doing there. So there are a lot of ways that you can have secure tenure other than the ones we're accustomed to. And similarly, if you go to one of these slums, just because it looks informal, and maybe is informal in the sense of built out of whatever they could find, and possibly at risk of falling down in the next storm, there might still actually be security of tenure for the people who are living there. And that can be true even if there isn't a title deed to the property. And Davis talks about this, that in fact, a lot of people who live in these places pay rent to somebody who claims and perhaps does actually exercise effective tenure over that parcel of real estate, whether or not that person actually owns that real estate in an officially recognized way. So insecurity of tenure, part of it isn't just that you don't have some kind of formally recognized claim. Part of it can just exist in the fact that perhaps nobody does, and you don't know when you might lose your tenure there, because you don't know when the person you're paying rent might suddenly be hauled in by the state and called to account for the fact that they don't have, in fact, a formal claim to that property. Does all that make sense? It's kind of like if you've been paying rent to your landlord and you've got a lease and you think everything's hunky-dory, and then suddenly you find out that your landlord is a fraud and doesn't in fact own the property. And that means that your lease doesn't in fact give you a right to be there because the lease itself is fraudulent. I mean, what if your landlord defaulted on the mortgage and the property got foreclosed, and suddenly your lease doesn't give you secure tenure anymore, right? There are actually protections against that kind of thing in certain parts of the world, like Berkeley. But in many parts of the world, there aren't. And it can create a certain kind of anxiety in which insecurity of tenure is, in fact, not knowing whether or when your tenure might suddenly vanish out from underneath you. Any questions? All right, 5-minute break. Go. Okay. I have a feeling I'm going too slowly. I may have to speed up here. Here's a map that attempts to depict trends in slums. I can't remember the temporal period. I believe this comes out of a UN report and attempts to indicate, are these slums, these areas of poverty and informal and insecure housing, are they increasing, decreasing, that kind of thing? And also, how prevalent are they? And so these are all relative measures of high degrees of slums, but they are constant. Slum constant, slum increasing. What? These are, oh boy, I need to go back and look at the original map here. The point of this being that, these are categories in which either they are high and constant or increasing, medium or increasing. So that would be places where the slum phenomenon is most pronounced, right? It's already very prevalent and or it's growing. So you can see it's concentrated in the middle part of Africa, India, parts of Asia, and parts but not all of Latin America. Yellow is the sort of medium category where there may be a lot of them but they're decreasing, or they're only low though they are increasing. And then green would be the lowest category where they aren't very prevalent yet, or they are very unprevalent, so to speak, and they are either constant or diminishing. And you can see this is highly uneven. Now, it's interesting that what we would consider to be the developed world, so the former Soviet Union, Europe, North America other than Mexico and Central America, and Australia are simply not on this map, right? And the reason for that is that they didn't do household surveys, right? Davis makes a point of noting that this UN report is based on a much more comprehensive data collection effort than had previously been available. Nonetheless, and this will happen frequently for us, certain kinds of questions are only asked in certain parts of the world. So in this case, it's the developing world that is the focus of this map. Davis. Here are some of his sort of basic sort of facts from which he is going to proceed, things he's going to try to explain. Cities have absorbed nearly 2/3 of the global population explosion since 1950, are currently growing by 1 million babies and migrants each week. Cities will account for virtually all future world population growth. 95% of this final build-out of humanity will occur in the urban areas of developing countries. Remember we talked? No, actually that was my other class. I apologize. It's anticipated that we will go from a world population of about 6.8 billion right now to something between 9 and 10 billion around mid-century, and then it will sort of stabilize. So he's talking about the final build-out. What he's talking about is there are projected to be about 2.5 or 3 billion more people living on Earth, and that's supposed to sort of be it. Where are those people going to be? Where are those people going to live? The point is, virtually all of them are going to live in cities, and the vast majority of them are going to live in cities in the developing world, in the poor parts of the world. The population of the developed world is basically already stabilizing and is not going to represent very much growth in the next 50 or 100 years. And the population of rural areas in the developed world is, in fact, expected to decline in absolute terms. The size of a city's economy often bears surprisingly little relationship to its population size, and vice versa. And here we get back to that question of some kind of balance between cities and countryside. The idea that cities grow because that's where there are jobs is not something you can take for granted. In fact, a great many cities seem to be, the size of them in terms of population seems to be completely out of proportion to the opportunities for livelihoods available there. He describes this as over-urbanization. driven by the reproduction of poverty, not by the supply of jobs. Now, the reproduction of poverty may seem like an odd term. What he's basically describing is this growth in urban areas, especially in the developing world, are not about the growth of jobs and the growth of economic activity in any formal sense. If anything, they are simply about the growth of poverty. This runs counter to the kind of tacit or implicit understanding that we have had about cities in most of the sort of Western tradition of thinking about civilization. 3/4 of the burden of future world population growth will be borne by faintly visible second-tier cities and smaller urban areas. So the map I showed a moment ago depicted the cities over 5 million people. But if you actually look at the total aggregate numbers, it's the next tier down of cities. Cities of maybe 1 million people that are going to be the location of the majority of this kind of growth. We shouldn't only think about the very largest cities when we think about urbanization. Any of you been to the Amazon basin in Brazil? It's very strange. You look at the map of Amazon and you see these dots. And they look like little dots. They look like, they're going to be little teeny towns. I looked at them the first time and I thought, oh, well, there's just little teeny towns, like maybe a couple hundred people or 1,000 people. But you actually get there and there are like 50,000 people living there. Those types of cities are, he says, the predominant form in which this urbanization is taking place. In many cases, rural people no longer have to migrate to the city. It migrates to them. In a lot of areas, cities are growing outward at a rate that just swallows up the surrounding countryside and the people who are living there. The result is a hermaphroditic landscape, a partially urbanized countryside, a form neither rural nor urban, but a blending of the two. So, Davis wants to explain why this has happened. And to do this, he needs to go through a number of steps, which you may need to go through as well as you set about analyzing something for your research paper. And in any event, this is a set of steps that are necessary to go from simply observing something to analyzing it. You need to define it. What is it? We just looked at a slide that offered a kind of composite definition of a slum. You need to conceptualize it. You need to think about how to think about it. You have to think about whether you have preconceptions that need to be interrogated. Are you making assumptions about this thing that you just happen to have brought to the subject, and they may or may not be true? You need to classify this phenomenon. How do you actually group together the examples of it that you see in the world into some kind of more manageable set of subcategories or types, right? Can you say, well, there are slums in Asia, and we'll call them Asian slums, and then there are slums in South America, we'll call them South American slums? Is that really a meaningful way to classify slums? Sure, it might mean that the slums in one category, the people who live there speak one language or have one religion versus the slums in another. But is that really relevant to this phenomenon of slums? Does it make sense to organize them that way? Or should you instead think about slums based on the overall size of each one or something like that? Is there something importantly different about a slum that has more than 100,000 people in it versus a slum that has less, something like that? You need to think about history and geography. Well, not only where are these places, but how long have they been there? You need to try to explain it. What are the things that have caused this phenomenon to manifest here and now, here in this way and there in another way? And you need, finally, to discriminate between relevant and not so relevant factors, characteristics, causes. What are the things that really explain it, and which things, in fact, can you ignore or don't explain it, even if you might at first think that they do? And finally, how do these various factors and processes interact? These are the pieces that you need to assemble to explain a phenomenon, a geographical phenomenon. So, defining slums. The etymology synonymous with racket or criminal trade as of about 1812. So even before it was associated with poverty, it was associated with crime as a term. It might not be so much a place where people who are poor live. It might instead have been a place where people who are criminals do the things they do. Dilapidated housing, overcrowding, disease, poverty, and vice in the 19th century. Very heavy moral overtones to this term. Overcrowding, poor or informal housing, inadequate access to safe water and sanitation, and insecurity of tenure. This is from the UN report. Slums are not the same thing as poor places. Here's a discrimination, a part of classifying what slums are. You can't just say anywhere there's poverty, it's a slum. Anywhere it's a slum, there's poverty. Because in fact, the two are not continuous and overlapping. They overlap, but they aren't completely overlapping. Not all urban poor live in slums, nor are all slum dwellers poor. The two categories obviously overlap in their majority, but the number of urban poor is considerably greater. There are more poor people living in cities than there are people living in slums. At least 1/2 of the world's urban population, as defined by poverty thresholds, income, are poor. But it's not the case that more than half of the world's population lives in slums, remember. It's just that, as of now, more than half live in cities. So here's a typology. This is a way of breaking down different types of slum and thereby attempting to make sense of the variations of this phenomenon. And this is the one that Davis uses. I'm going to run through it really quickly. So first, he distinguishes between slums that are located inside a core metropolitan area. And here we might think of the slums of industrial cities in the 19th century or early 20th century, right? Slums, if you think about early 20th century Manhattan, there were areas of very high density, poor, working class tenement housing, and that is a type of slum, or it can be a type of slum. And then there are slums on the periphery. This is his first major division among slums. Within those, you have formal versus informal. So those tenement houses in New York City may have actually been places where people did have sort of formal rights to be there, but they were still living in conditions that we would consider to be slum-like, right? Inadequate access to water and sanitation, for example. On the periphery, you've got formal and informal, plus you have refugee camps. He suggests this is another important type of slum that is sort of neither formal nor informal. These are camps that literally just sprout up very abruptly in response to various kinds of disasters or catastrophes, whether they're wars or earthquakes, right? You can break the formal metro ones into different kinds: tenements, public housing, hostels and flop houses. Informal, you can think about squatters versus pavement dwellers. Squatters being people who actually take over a building that they don't have any legal claim to and live there in a semi-permanent way. Pavement dwellers being people who simply sort of occupy whatever space they can find and may move around significantly and not even really have what we might think of as a house or a residence of any kind. Within those categories, hand-me-down tenements versus built-for-poor tenements. There are tenements built as low-income housing. Many of these, about 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there were vast areas of Chicago that were occupied by huge public housing tenements that have mostly been torn down since then. Hand-me-downs refers to places that weren't built for low-income or poor people, but have become places where they live. And typically these are places that have also sort of deteriorated over time. Housing that used to be middle-class housing and over time has become poor housing. Informally, you can have authorized versus unauthorized squatters. Some squatter settlements are sort of tacitly recognized by the authorities and are allowed to be there, even though they don't have any legal claim. Others are unauthorized and, in fact, in many cases, may be actively destroyed at periodic moments by the authorities in an attempt to remove them or get these people to stop occupying these places. Out on the periphery, you can break down formal, informal, and refugee camps into other subdivisions, private rental versus public housing. So are these places owned by private parties and rented to the people who live there, or are they owned by the government and provided to the people who live there by the government under a public program or a subsidized arrangement of some kind? Pirate subdivisions versus squatters. What's a pirate subdivision? Anybody remember? Yeah.
It's like somebody legally owns an area of land but illegally subsidizes it.
Okay. So a subdivision that was sort of put in place without permission from the authorities. There are variations on this, varieties of this in different places, but somebody might actually own the land, but the zoning of the city might say that's not residential land at all. But the owner decides to go ahead and put a bunch of houses on it without getting the proper permits and authorizations, and people move in and live there. It's a pirate subdivision. Finally, authorized, site and service, unauthorized, owner-occupied versus rental. Here, the person subdividing it might actually own the land but not have permission to put a house there. Others might be rented. Site and service squatters, this refers to a situation in which people occupy a place and start living there, and the government comes along and says, okay, we'll go ahead and provide you with certain services to be here, even though, technically speaking, you're not supposed to be here at all. Site and services refers to maybe they do bring in a water line or some kind of electricity, that kind of thing, to provide services, even though these are essentially squatters. These are all variations on slums. Preconceptions versus data. There are a number of stereotypes out there which Davis says aren't supported by the actual empirical facts. The idea that slums are all inner city ghettos. And this, maybe not so much today, but 40 or 50 years ago, there was, I think, a strong association of slums and the inner city. These were poor, blown-out areas inside of industrial, very built-up, densely urbanized areas. And that's where you expected to find a slum. And this goes back to 19th century England. On the other, in actual fact, more than 2/3 of the poor live in the peripheries, around the outskirts of major urban areas, as most of you who have seen them described it. There's a stereotype that sprawl is a first world phenomenon. This expansion outwards of cities to develop into suburbs, right? The sort of high land use, large areas of land sprawling out around these cities, that this is a first world phenomenon associated especially with the post-World War II period in the United States. But in fact, since 1970, the larger share of world urban population growth has been absorbed by slum communities on the periphery of third world cities. This is actually a third world phenomenon, much more so than a first world phenomenon. Stereotype of slum dwellers as squatters, that they don't pay rent. Davis points out that the data do not support this, that in fact, many of them, there are lots and lots of rent-paying people in slums. It may look like they're just occupying that space, but in fact, there's somebody who claims that space as their own and demands rent from these people. Many of them, in fact, both pay and receive rents. So you have a lot of what we might call subletting going on, right? Somebody arranges to rent a space from one person and then turns around and rents a part of that space to somebody else and collects rent from that person. a stereotype that pavement dwellers are unemployed and recent migrants, that the people you see sleeping on the sidewalk don't have jobs and just arrived from the countryside and are, not yet employed. It turns out that almost all of them have some income. 2/3 have been in the city for more than 6 years, and 1/3 have been evicted from places they were living in the city, in the case of Mumbai, for example. History and geography. When did slums emerge? And this gets to the core of what Davis is going to try to explain. They emerged after about 1950. There are antecedent examples, but as a worldwide phenomenon, this is not very old. Maybe 60 years. Why hadn't they emerged before? You can identify a variety of reasons why they hadn't emerged before, many of them having to do with policy. In communist China and the Soviet Union, they didn't emerge because it was illegal for them to emerge. The state mandated who could move where. There was not a lot of freedom to relocate from the countryside to the city, even if you wanted to. And this was simply a policy decision on the part of the authorities. Yeah?
When did you say slums emerged?
According to Davis, slums as a global phenomenon emerge around and after 1950. This is a post-World War II phenomenon. It's also very closely linked to the end of colonialism. You think about Africa and large parts of Asia. During the period when they were effectively ruled by European powers, the European powers there, likewise, like the Soviets and the Chinese Communist government, you had to get permission to move. You want to move from the countryside to the city, you need permission from the authorities. If you even get that permission, once you get to the city, you're only allowed to live in certain places. And the colonial authorities controlled who could move, where they could live. And in many cases, that was enough to prevent the emergence of slums because it was simply illegal for people to choose to just go to the city and take up residence wherever they might find a place to sleep. Yeah?
Isn't that illegal in China still?
Technically, it's still illegal in China, yes. It's not to say that it's not happening anyway. And we'll see a lot of that in the movie towards the end of the semester, Tank Man. What precipitated their emergence? What kinds of things can we say caused this in a sort of immediate sense? Policy changes, the end of colonialism, or the fall of the Soviet Union. Civil wars and counterinsurgencies, many of them associated with the Cold War, dislocated a lot of people. Many Cold War proxy battles, that is, wars that took place in various parts of the world in which one side was backed by the United States and the other side was backed by the Soviet Union. A lot of them were actually carried out in the countryside and involved various kinds of recruitment, persecution, and in some cases outright bombardment of rural areas, which drove a lot of rural people into cities where it was, they hoped, safer. Modernization programs, we'll talk a lot about that later in the semester. Intentional efforts on the part of governments and international lending agencies to generate urban growth and industrial development and create jobs, and also to modernize agriculture. Huge investments made to make the agricultural practices of farmers in the third world look like the agricultural practices of farmers in the first world, and thereby increase productivity and reduce demand for work and jobs in the countryside. And finally, international debt, structural adjustment programs, fiscal crises, and corruption. All of these things precipitated the conditions in which slums could emerge. And again, don't worry about the fact that you might, right now, reading the first couple chapters of Davis, feel like you don't have all the information you need to make sense of what he's saying. We're just putting this out here on the table to start the semester, and by the end of the semester, hopefully these types of things will be familiar to you and will make sense. Did I skip something here? No. Okay, discrimination explanation. Slums are a worldwide phenomenon during the post-1950 historical period. This is perhaps the central mystery that Davis wants to try to make sense of. It would be one thing if slums had emerged in part of the world and not in other parts of the world. And there was some kind of neat, clean, tidy mapping of slums and some other phenomenon, right? But in fact, they've emerged both in colonial settings and in post-colonial settings. So it's not about whether there's colonialism or not. They've emerged both in capitalist and in communist and socialist countries. So apparently it's not about that distinction, the sort of Cold War distinction. In countries of a variety of religious, ethnic, linguistic, and cultural circumstances, it's not limited to the Christian world, the Muslim world, whatever. Exacerbated by wars, droughts, famines, upheavals, and so forth, but not solely caused by such calamities. There are plenty of slums where we can say, aha, well, that is an outgrowth of a war or of a natural disaster. But there are also plenty of places where slums have emerged without there being any single identifiable event of that kind that triggered the emergence of a slum. So none of these things can explain slums, just as a simple empirical deduction, right? Concentrated in the global south, but there are also slums in the global north. So we might associate them with the developing world, but they are not limited to the developing world. So that also can't be a simple, straightforward explanation of their emergence. We look at some maps. You just map population density across the world, and you would think if population density were what created slums, you would think that they would all be over here in Asia and parts of Europe where population density is highest. But it's not simply a function of population density, because in fact, there are plenty of slums in parts of the world that are relatively sparsely populated. It's not just a matter of wealth. There are a lot of slums in poor parts of the world, shown here most dramatically in Central Africa. But there are also slums in parts of the world where per capita income is actually pretty significant. This is gross national income, or I'm sorry, this is not per capita, this is just gross. But there, it runs the gamut of the overall wealth of different countries. So there again, that alone cannot explain the emergence of slums. You map this against urbanization. So this, the colors, the background colors are the percentages of the urban population is a percentage of total. And then you see the circles are cities of different sizes. And the most urbanized countries in the world, in terms of how much of the population lives in urban areas, are actually, in many cases, the wealthier ones. The United States is an extremely urbanized country. But we don't think of the United States as being where the bulk of the slums are. And we saw a moment ago on a previous map that China and India are where the densest populations in the world exist of humans, but they are not, in fact, the most urbanized countries. They are significantly less, 20 to 40% of the population live in cities. Huge numbers of people live in the countryside. So here again, it's not just a function of wealth or overall numbers. Slums, here we go. Slums are produced through the actions of individual people and groups in particular places, yet they manifest certain globally characteristic features. Perhaps this is the central paradox. Any given slum in a given place is the result of activities of people and phenomena, processes or events that are locally determined, right? An individual landowner decides to do a pirate subdivision on a big piece of land on the outskirts of a city. What made that person decide to do that is very likely a very specific local explanation. And yet, this sort of collection of local decisions and activities and events are producing similar results around the world. How can that be the case? And this perhaps gets to the central dilemma of thinking about regions today. You have characteristic phenomena around the world that can't be explained as simply the result of single global processes. And yet they look like they have these common features. How do you explain that? And if I have time, maybe I'm not going to have time to go through all of these. Oh, I got 5 minutes. Okay. So let's bring this back to the central focus of the class as a whole, the semester as a whole. Regions. What are they? And how might we start to think about them? They are observable patterns in space. They might be about ecology, climate, or plants and soils, that kind of thing. They might be social. They might be manifest in terms of linguistic patterns or religion or ethnicity or politics. They might be combinations of both. Built environments, economies that incorporate natural resources in certain ways and are therefore both social and somehow determined by underlying ecological or physical processes. They are empirically real. They are patterns that are out there in the world. We can see them. On the other hand, observing them is an act that we do. The patterns we see are in part a function of what we look for and how we define what counts as similar or dissimilar over space. The act of seeing those regions can in turn affect the reality we are observing. The way in which political or economic elites look at the world and see regions can strongly affect what they then do with those places. So that mental moment of deciding that there is such a thing as that place, an economic development zone, can strongly determine what patterns subsequently emerge. And we cannot not do this. We can't just sort of say to ourselves, oh, no, regions are obsolete or they're somehow creatures of our mind and we're going to live without them. We automatically see pattern in space and think about it. And there's no way to avoid this. We can think about a series of scales at which regions can be discerned, can be observed, from households and neighborhoods through cities and states all the way out to continents. We can put measurements of distance on them somewhat like this. These patterns are produced over time, which is to say that they have a history, and the processes that produce them, like the patterns themselves, are both empirically real and simultaneously they are acts of our conceptualization. Right? To identify them as processes is to actually act on that world we are observing. They are abstracted from empirical reality and to some degree simplifications. The processes we describe, urbanization, we say that that's a process. That's an abstraction from all of the different examples we might see and look at in the world. It's calling it something. And that is a mental process that is not simply a passive reflection of the reality we're looking at. It's an active thing to do. And again, we can't not do this. We can't avoid thinking this way. I got 2 minutes left. So temporally, we can think about temporal scales as well. We can think about things that happen in a single day, like the earthquake in Haiti. We can think about other processes that take much longer to unfold, such as urbanization or domestication of agriculture. We can put temporal units on those temporal scales, just as we put spatial units on the spatial scales. Then we can put them together and we can think about space-time. We can think about processes that have spatial and temporal scales that fit together in certain ways. Generally speaking, a small spatial scale and a small temporal scale fit together. We don't think about the domestication of agriculture at the scale of households. We think about it at the scale of continents and millennia. All right, I'm going to save these last couple slides for next time. We will see you on Thursday.